Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining IF's webinar on the cost of living crisis. It's really lovely to see all of you, albeit virtually. My name is Alisa Anwar. I'm a broadcast journalist and I'm a trustee for the Intergenerational Foundation. I'm also the host and producer of IF's wonderful monthly podcast series. And I want to welcome you all to this very exciting webinar breaking down the cost of living crisis facing young people and also having a discussion of what we can do about it. Before we start the webinar, I've got a little bit of housekeeping. So you'll see we do have a chat function where you can put all of your questions, big and small, throughout the webinar, and we'll try and get to them and get them answered in the final part. I'd advise kind of to get them in early. Whenever you think of a question, pop them in and I can come to them at the end. I also just want to make you aware that this event is being recorded and we are going to be uploading onto YouTube. So if you choose to ask a question with your video on, then that will obviously be picked up and broadcast on YouTube. So if you don't want this, please turn off your video and you can just ask your question with audio, or I'm more than happy to ask the question on your behalf, just make it clear. So a little bit of background on IF. What do we stand for? Well, the Intergenerational Foundation has been working solely to campaign for intergenerational fairness in British policymaking for now over a decade. And we want to ensure that all policy is assessed for its impact on future generations. We're known widely for our work on pensions, housing, mental health, student loans, and most prominently, if I could direct you towards IF's 10-year anniversary report, which is a fantastic read, and it looks at the plight of younger generations across the last decade. And you'll find that all of IF's research, blogs, campaigns, reports, podcasts at www.if.org.uk. So tonight, we're really going to delve into the topic that is at the forefront of the news headlines at the moment, the cost of living crisis, its impact on young people and what we can do about it. And this webinar is not possible without our incredible panelists. So I want to welcome you. And panelists, if you give a little hello or wave when I introduce you. Alana McSkimming, there she is. Alana works in marketing and is an advocate for young people, their rights and their opportunities. Recently, she was interviewed by The Guardian, specifically analysing the cost of living crisis. And she's also appeared in IF's podcast episodes. Next, we have John Hobby with a lovely background. John is a researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation. He's got a strong background in economics and has also authored our well-received Packhorse Generation report, whilst also working on papers looking at aviation and net zero. And finally, we've got Jeevun Sandher. Jeevun, you can give a little wave. Jeevun is an economist and political scientist, and he's currently a doctoral researcher at King's College London, specialising in inequality and its causes. And he's also spoken on multiple TV and radio stations, recently appearing on BBC, LBC, very interesting discussion, which I listened to. Unfortunately, Emily won't be joining us today due to personal reasons. So on behalf of IF, we're sending all of our thoughts to her and her family. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to start with some segments from our wonderful panelists. We're going to move into a question answer session, and I'll signpost you along the way so you can follow through. Any questions you have, pop them in the chat throughout and we'll get to them at the end. So Jeevun, I'm going to start with you. The cost of living crisis, it arguably impacts everybody. So how is this a crisis that impacts the young the most?
Sure. First of all, it's wonderful to be here. I think to really understand why this is hitting the young so hard is simply because of where the young were before this started. You know, of all the generations, young people were doing the worst. And that's because we grew up in a generation where, well, for our generation, how well we do is really about how rich our parents are, not really about how hard we work. You then had this kind of huge once in a lifetime fall in incomes that hits us, the generation, hardest because we're at the bottom. And then actually, in terms of how you fix that, well, actually, like, just get more money into young people's pockets, make sure they have houses to live in, and make sure their votes are counted properly. That's where young people sit. So, like, why, like, is it that young people will sit in a world where they can't do very well without having rich parents? Well, firstly, like, you know, across all advanced economies, we're now in this graduate takes all labor market. okay, you need to get a degree to get a good job. And before we even got to this year, 1 in 3 people couldn't afford the basics. When you consider the fact that half of young generations are now getting degrees, it means getting a degree, if you like, is a prerequisite for living a decent life. And actually, who gets to go to university? Well, a lot of that has to do with how rich your parents are. You're twice likely to go to university if your parents are the top fifth as opposed to the bottom fifth. But of course, on top of that, if you are a graduate, that doesn't mean that life is all rosy. It means you have to move to major cities to get good jobs. But because there aren't enough houses, you're then stuck with exorbitant costs. You know, in London, about 40% or more of your income will go onto rent. And over the past 20 years, house prices up by over 100%, wages up by only 20%. And that was before COVID. And that's why for young people, home ownership rates half what they were for the baby boomers. What that means for young people, actually, if you want to buy a house, really need the bank of mum and dad. And on top of that as well, policy choices that hit the young. So graduates, marginal tax rate of 42.25%, 20% income tax, 9% on student loan repayments, 30.25% on national insurance, and social security cuts that really hit the young after 2010. A low income family with 2 kids lost about £2,000 before this cost of living crisis began. That's where we were kind of before we entered this point. And then we entered this point, and then young people were just hit on the other side. First of all, lots of people now returning to cities, but young people having to rent, so being hit with much higher rental costs. At the moment, prices are going up by 11%. That number is going to increase. House prices increased massively during the pandemic as well as that. On top of that, we've also seen wages. Young people are dependent, of course, on wages to do well because they don't own lots of assets, and those are now getting eroded by inflation. And then you have, on top of all that, policy choices that make things worse for young people. I was talking about student loan repayments, so actually lowering that threshold by another £2,000. That's equivalent to another £200 tax rise on young people. A cost of living package that isn't enough for young people. So a low-income pensioner will get £1,150. A low-income family with 2 kids will only get £850. That means the low-income pensioner has enough cash to deal with the extra energy bills. It means that actually, if you are a low-income family, you're not going to have enough money. You're about £550 short. And that's why we're sitting in a place where young people and children, 1 in 5 of them going hungry, about 25% more likely. So that's where you sit in kind of once in a generation fall, but you can absolutely fix all that, okay? So first and foremost, like a proper cost of living package. You've had this once in a lifetime fall in income, actually respond with a once in a lifetime response. You could have increased social security payments, including pensions, by the way, in line with prices, get the universal credit uplift back and send a £1,000 check to every household, tax it to make it progressive. And that's about 10% of what we spent on COVID. And crucially as well, helps those middle class people and sort of middle income graduates who are actually also struggling. Like 40% of people were already cutting back on food. So another £200 isn't going to do a huge amount when actually kind of the middle income family is losing about 2,000. So actually help across the distribution, like actually just build more houses, which is, I think, something we would all agree with and know that's something we have to do. And finally, actually political reform as well. So young people have to live in major cities to get good jobs, but it also means that young people's voice and votes aren't being counted. The 10 safest seats in the country are Labour, 8 of them in or near major cities. There are about 13 constituencies in the country where young people under 30s make more than 40% of the population. There is none where that's true of pensioners. So actually make sure young people have a political voice. So that's where we are, that's how we got here, and that's how we hopefully fix it.
I think people forget that, you know, on top of rising prices and bills, which impacts everybody, young people tend to earn less, exactly like you said. They have student loans, like you said. And I think your point about housing was very interesting because Halifax has estimated that the average deposit for a first-time buyer is just under 60 grand now. And that's a lot of money. And you mentioned the bank of mum and dad, and not everybody has that. So young people are hit by this triple whammy of financial hardship that their older peers, they didn't have at all, and they don't have now. So John, you've done quite a lot of research, sorry, I should say, into this area. How do you see the cost of living crisis and how it impacts the young?
Sure. So just as a quick bit of background, as I'm sure you all know, inflation as measured by the CPI reached 9% per year in April, which is a 4-decade high that's going to squeeze the incomes of everyone, sort of young and old, everyone across the income distribution. However, I believe that the recent inflationary pressure will hit young people the hardest and will be felt unevenly between the generations due to a combination of tax policy decisions, the setup of student loans, as Jeevun mentioned, and how young people are forced to spend their money. And I'll sort of tackle these one by one and start with taxation. So sort of overall, the government are freezing key income tax brackets during a time of high inflation to take advantage of an economic phenomenon known as fiscal drag to increase total tax receipts and pay back the over £400 billion of debt accrued during the COVID crisis. It kind of sounds a little bit confusing because, at least to me anyway, because it doesn't necessarily logically follow that a frozen tax bracket is sort of a tax rise, but sort of I'll provide an example to sort of help illustrate how this works. So someone who was earning £30,000 in 2021 would pay income tax at 20% on around £17,500 of their income, sort of after accounting for the £12,500 tax-free allowance. So over the past year, they've seen their cost of living rise by 10% because of inflation. So in the best case scenario, they managed to negotiate a 10% pay rise with their boss. This means they're now receiving £33,000 per year, but they're now paying income tax on 62% of their income. So that's around £20,000 as opposed to £17,000 before, even though the inflation adjusted value of their income hasn't changed at all. So this is what's known as fiscal drag, and it means that during times of high inflation, the tax-free allowances and the low tax allowances are squeezed and decline in real value. So this is relevant because the government have decided to freeze the income tax threshold and the national insurance thresholds at their 2021 levels until 2026. And they've also decided to freeze the student loan thresholds until next year, at least. And actually for future graduates, as Jeevun mentioned, it's being dropped by £2,000. So the logic that I outlined above of the frozen tax thresholds applies to all three modes of taxation. So this means that everyone will be paying more of their income in tax, but our analysis shows that this will be felt especially by low and middle earners who are more likely to be young and by university graduates. So going back a little bit back into our reports, which we published back in February, Packhorse Generation, we, like many central banks, underestimated the scale and persistence of recent inflation. So using the most recent Bank of England forecasts, which sort of suggest that their 2% target won't be reached until 2024, we now find that a graduate who is earning £27,000 in 2021 will see their real discretionary income, which is the amount of money they have left after taxation and necessary spending, once adjusted for inflation, will drop by 44% over the next 5 years, which is an extremely large drop to their living standards. Going back to student loans as well, high inflation doesn't just impact the spending power of graduates now, it's also going to affect them far into the future. And this is because the interest rates on student loans is linked to the retail price index from the previous March. So in September, for some graduates, it will go up to 12% per year, which will which will mean that graduates accrue much more debt at a much faster rate, and keep them paying their student loans for much longer, which will be a sort of a large drag on their future income. Inflation is also felt unevenly between the generations because of what people spend their money on. So, sort of a headline figure of 9% CPI. Sort of a lot of the details of how that inflation is happening is lost in the process of combining sort of the prices of a lot of goods into one single number. So the current inflation is being driven predominantly by energy and housing costs. And the ONS family workbook suggests that young people spend around 30% of their income, that's under 30, spend around 30% of their income on housing and energy, compared to just 13% for 50 to 64-year-olds. Young people, sort of, as Jeevun mentioned, have been locked out of the sort of the property market, so tend to live in poorly insulated rental properties, which further increases their heating bills. So that both of these suggest to me that young people are likely to be severely hit by the recent inflationary pressure because at the moment it's being driven by energy and housing costs. We also found back in 2019 that young people spend almost 2/3 of their expenditure on essential spending, which leaves them little room to tighten their belts sort of during inflation, because sort of older generations, it tends to be that their spending is on sort of maybe more luxury goods that they can cut back on, whereas young people don't have that opportunity. And then finally, the last point that I want to make is regarding savings. So what little savings young people have managed to accrue during their working career will most likely be significantly eroded in the next few years. Interest rates are much lower than the current inflation figures. So young people have been locked out of the property market, which means that they can't, their savings are poorly protected from inflation. And in fact, they will experience the opposite of this protection, because property owners and landlords will be able to increase prices and increase rents in order to sort of protect themselves from inflation, whereas young people will bear the cost of that. So yeah, just to summarize, I believe that inflation will be particularly hard on young people due to fiscal drag, the punitive student loan system, and how they're forced to spend their money. Thank you.
I think it's interesting because the recent tax changes and inflation, everything, it impacts low earners the most, and those do predominantly end up being students. And on top of that, like you said, we've got student loans, which, if believe, is essentially a graduate tax. So young people are being hit hard on all angles. Alana, you are a perfect case study for everything that Jeevun and John have said. So tell us, what is it like being a young person who's effectively living through this cost of living crisis?
Okay, I think that's kind of an interesting question. Like, I think I'm probably not the perfect example, because obviously I think I am quite well off, like, myself in it. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect me. Like, I don't earn, like, I earn kind of quite a modest salary. So, knowing that that money is kind of it's not gonna go as far, the bills go up. I'm very worried about, especially the next generation of people, the whole 40-year graduate thing. I think if you are, someone who's graduated next year, or you start uni next year and you graduate, you could be paying that back into your like pension years. Obviously, I think it affects us in terms of saving at the moment. Like, we can't save for things like that. You always hear, well, you should be saving X, Y, Z into your savings, even when you're like 20 years old or something or other. Where's that money coming from? I've seen ridiculous numbers. Like, you need to save £500 a month when you're 20 for your pension. These people haven't even got houses or, emergency funds. So I just think that we're being kind of forgotten about. Like, our future is kind of not there. And obviously, the worse it gets for us now and in the present, the harder it is for us to, do stuff to prepare for the future as well. And I think that's the issue. Like, everyone was saying, people on modest salaries, especially people who are, maybe they're not on universal credit and they're just floating above that line, they didn't get support. Like, the pensioners are getting like a 350 extra, I think. And I know that people on universal credit, or some of them at least, are getting an additional amount of money. People who are just floating above that line aren't getting additional money, and they could be families on low incomes, relatively low incomes, and they're not getting the assistance that they should be getting. Their spending power is being reduced by thousands of pounds a year, and they've got nothing. And it does scare me. People who live in London, especially, and minimum wage there, I don't even know how they will survive on, like, people who are on 19,000 pounds a year as is, their spending power being reduced by like 1,000 or 2,000 pounds a year just from energy bills. That is just, it's insane to think about, that somebody on such a low wage is being left to try and to pay to survive on that. It's absolutely ridiculous.
So stepping away from the economics and politics, what do you think the mental health impact of this cost of living crisis is on the young, Alana?
It's stressful. I think it's always not knowing. Like, sometimes you have to just try and forget about it, because you think, what's the point of thinking about it every day? I can't, nothing's going to change, unfortunately, by me worrying about it every day. But the fact is it is a worrying situation when you know that you're not in a financial position to look after yourself now in terms of, hard times, let alone in the future. Like, you can't just go, oh well, tomorrow I'll well, tomorrow. No, you have to start now, and you can't even pay. Some people are not going to be able to pay their bills, this month or next month. So it's so stressful. I can understand people, like, why people get more and more like I don't know, like, big numbers or whatever, but I do know that they say in recent times people, like, mental health is on the up, like the issues and stuff. I think it must have a lot to do with, like, financial insecurity, especially with young people.
I would like to take this time just to remind everyone that you can post questions in the chat to our panelists, and in the next 10 to 15 minutes, we'll come to them. So Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called the current situation that we are in the aftershock of COVID. I am interested, how much do you think COVID can be blamed for the current cost of living crisis? How much do you think it is other factors? Jeevun, can I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. So in one sense, there are certainly global factors that have led to this point, right? And part of that is due to, like, supply chain disruptions after COVID. Like, inflation is not a UK only problem. That's certainly been a huge part of it. Another part of it was certainly also Putin's invasion of Ukraine, leading to rising energy and food bills that we're seeing, so kind of added on top of that. So we're already seeing rising energy and food, and Putin's kind of put boosters underneath all of that. And finally, there is this, like, other sense in which it is just because central banks kept interest rates too low for too long. And also in the UK, like, we printed about £900 billion of cash and did that to support kind of asset prices in the economy. Now, that was the right decision, but it has now led to inflation. So there is some fairness to, like, that point, right? But actually, the pandemic was also a global phenomenon. Like, the fact that you have this global storm is not a reason to turn around and go, oh, well, guys, like, out of our control. Like, the point is you respond to problems and you meet the moment that you're faced with. And so whatever the cause of this is, it's kind of like, it's useful analytically, it's useful for the Bank of England from a policy perspective, but it's not useful from the perspective of what is our motive. And our motive should be everyone should be able to live a decent life. So yes, some global causes, but actually that's no excuse for not fixing it.
What about you, John?
I'd essentially say the same thing, sort of like, yes, the recent price inflation that we're experiencing in the UK is largely due to, sort of short-term unforeseeable factors, sort of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and COVID, global supply chain disruptions, all that kind of thing. But why is it that, sort of what is, in the long historical view, a relatively short period of inflation, why is that causing such a big problem for so many people? It's because of, sort of decades of policy failure in housing, in social spending, in all kinds of ways that mean so many people who were on the brink of just being able to get by, sort of a few years ago, now with these disruptions are suddenly, sort of forced into situations where people can't afford to heat their homes. People, sort of more and more people using food banks, people who sort of, you hear reports about it on the radio every day, people who can't afford the energy to, sort of turn their oven on, which I think, I don't know, sort of, we consider ourselves a developed, sort of rich country. The fact that sort of that, it just shows how stark the inequality is here in the UK, in my opinion. The fact that, sort of one short burst of inflation can cause this much damage, as we're seeing already, hearing from Alana about the mental health impacts, all these kind of things. So no, I think that the rising cost of living is yes, to do with short-term factors, but the cost of living crisis is a much longer phenomenon.
And Alana, is there anything you want to add?
Not really. I feel like it's the same thing. Like, obviously these things of the big kind of immediate quickening of the problem has been led by these kind of external factors, but there were plenty of young people in, like, not great positions before this. Like, they were hanging on the edge before, and the government or, like, the policies were not there to, you know, support them during that time. So that meant that one thing hit, and they obviously just hoped that it wouldn't, but it did, and it's led people to disaster.
So we've talked about the causes, the consequences. What can we do about the problem? What can the government do in the short term, and what can they do in the next 10 to 15 years, so the long term? Alana, can I start with you?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't think
okay.
you'd come to me first.
That's fine. We've talked about all of the causes and the consequences, but it's a problem that we need to resolve. So what can the government do in the short term to help assist the cost of living crisis, and what can they do in the long term?
That's really interesting. I feel like so many policies that you think, oh, that could help. It has kind of an effect on something else that actually makes something worse. It's one of those things where it's like the rental thing. You think, well, why are there people owning 5 homes when there are plenty of people who can't own one? But then if you get all the landlords out of the rental market, suddenly there's less places for rent. People don't have money to buy the houses. The rents go up. Like, there's so many different like effects. If I gave an answer, it could very well be the detriment of what I want to happen. But I do think we need to have I know like we have they say quite a progressive tax system and things like that. I don't know. I would argue like if 2 people are working 40 hours a week, someone's earning, well, let's say they were taxed, one was taxed 60% and one was 20%, but the person taxed 60%, 40% of their income, let's say, was 100K a year. I understand like 60% sounds like a lot of money, but you have enough left, a lot left. Like I don't like versus someone else, you can't put food on the table. And I completely appreciate that sounds maybe a bit whack, but I just think if they can afford the tax increases, they should shoulder them. Like those with the broadest shoulders should shoulder the most weight. And I know that you might think that's unfair. They already contribute the most to tax because obviously they earn the most. You cannot have people who cannot feed their children, so that you can have, when you already have the money you have left is a ton of money. It may already be 5 times someone else's salary. So I can't justify, and I know that that's maybe a bit controversial. I just think that the tax, you know, needs to be a bit different. I think the student loans thing is a joke. I don't think that's right at all. Plenty of other progressive countries have free university education. I've moved to Scotland. It has free university education. It's absolutely ridiculous putting that burden on people. We already have people who have to put more and more money towards their pension. Like it's been drilled into us because, oh, you know, maybe the state's going to pull back, or, you know, there's not going to be less available, or state pension's not enough that they thought it would be, but now we know it's not going to be. So we're being told we need to put more into this and we need to invest in our futures. But we're also being told to pay for our university education and pay for this and that. And it's just like, these are things that the previous generation didn't have to pay. They weren't worrying about. They're just like, well, the state's going to pick up the tab for that. And then who picks up the tab for it? Young people. And then, yeah, I just think it's just a tax thing. I think they just haven't managed the money right, or the prioritize who it goes to. I don't believe that young people should be paying for promises that were obviously made in ill judgment in the past. And yeah, I don't really have a solution, because I do know that whatever you say, something else, the opposite of what you want to happen, could happen. So yeah, I'm not an expert on money and stuff. So
John, what do you think in the short and long term? What are possible solutions? I know Alana said there isn't one, and I agree with that. I don't think there is one.
Well, I also kind of agree that, especially in the short term, you know, sort of because these problems are so deep rooted and come from sort of such a range of policy failures, coming up with a short-term solution to solve this cost of living crisis is incredibly difficult. You know, so I think, as Alana essentially said, sort of, in my opinion, raising tax on sort of the very wealthiest and using that to cushion the blow on people who are really struggling in this cost of living crisis would help in the short term. Sort of unfreezing the tax brackets and moving them in line with inflation. Again, it's sort of tweaking about the margins, but increasing people's taxes by stealth during a cost of living crisis is, in my opinion, just completely unacceptable and counterproductive. But no, in the short term, because these things are so, you know, sort of have such deep causes and have been sort of brewing for so long and only showing their faces truly now, coming up with short-term solutions is really, really difficult. But looking further in towards the long term, I think a proper system of wealth taxation would be a serious step towards addressing the inequality that's causing this cost of living crisis. So what wealth inequality in the UK has been growing steadily over the past few decades, especially sort of amongst the sort of, you know, the very wealthiest in society. And the fact that we don't have adequate systems to sort of present that to prevent that natural accumulation, or not prevent that accumulation, but, you know, to make sure that that growth is essentially shared. Because what we've seen is, yes, the UK has been growing over the past few decades, but the proceeds have not been evenly shared throughout society. And those proceeds have not been taxed adequately to allow those, you know, sort of those funds to be diverted to the people who need it most, and to allow us to have a proper system of, you know, sort of a proper social welfare system, essentially. So a proper wealth taxation system and redistribution would certainly help. Building more houses, you know, sort of it's a simple point, but sort of for me, housing is a very, very central issue in the cost of living crisis, especially how it, you know, sort of with how it pertains to young people. Which obviously has been a result of decades of policy failure and short-term thinking, ranging from Help to Buy in the 80s, buy-to-let mortgages in the 90s, which have just meant that, sort of, yes, it delivered short-term benefits, but have meant that house prices continue to skyrocket. So just, yeah, building more houses and allowing young people a decent, sort of safe place to live at an affordable price would help with that too.
And Jeevun, finally, you, what do you think are the short and long-term solutions to this?
Sure. I think, so I started like the short term, right, which to me is like the £1,000 check to every household, you tax it, you get universal credit uplift back, and you increase those social security payments in line with prices. I think the important thing to remember about just getting enough cash in people's pockets is the reason why you have that £1,000 check is because you want universal social security payments. Okay, incredibly well targeted social security payments are also incredibly small one. You know, the United States is a very well targeted welfare system. That's also why it's one of the least generous welfare systems in the OECD. If you're only giving payments to those right at the bottom, it also means actually there's not a kind of a political coalition to have them increase. It's one reason why, like, cutting child benefit from the top 10%, for example, you kind of go, oh, they don't really need it, but you've also lost a huge amount of support that you need. I think also, like, talking about building more houses, I think is really right. I think one of the big things, actually, planning reform. I've heard in France it takes about 2 weeks to get a planning application approved. In the UK, it takes years. And the reason why in France, because you have certain criteria you have to meet, and they go, okay, build the housing. Now, I live in London. Like, it's bonkers that I live in London, in Bow, and there are like 2-story houses here. Like, that's insane. Like put 4 stories everywhere. It doesn't destroy a skyline, and guess what makes life a lot cheaper? Why is poverty highest in London? Because it has such high housing costs. We have the highest poverty rate in the country where I live, here in Tower Hamlets for children. I suppose one thing we haven't spoken about yet either is really transport. Not enough public transport. Good public transport would help. And the long term, I suppose the other thing is really around, yes, electoral reform is certainly the big one. That's kind of the big prize at the end of it all. You know, the ways in which the votes are counted will have a huge impact on outcomes. If you want to see that the kind of opposite of that, you know, look at, for example, the United States and gun control, right? Why is it that 90% support background checks, but you can't get it through? It's because in the Senate, 40 senators can block any given piece of legislation, and Republicans hold seats where there are very few people in rural states. So we had like 160 million people represented by senators who want gun control, 115 million who block it, and it doesn't happen. Like, political power matters. How your votes translate matter. And it is a really big prize, but it's not one that's kind of ripe for a bumper sticker.
I have a lot more questions, but I'm keeping an eye on the time. And actually, I think I might turn to the questions that we have in the chat. So who's our first one? Max. Max, do you want me to read out your question, or you can unmute yourself? I don't know if you have the power to do that. Or I can read the question out.
Hi, yeah. No, you can read the question out. I wasn't able to unmute myself properly. Yeah, if you go for it. I can't remember what exactly I wrote. It was a while ago.
So it's a question for Jeevun. It says, why is it politically acceptable for pretty modestly earning graduates to pay marginal tax rates in excess of 40% when we include student loan repayments, essentially a graduate tax? That's the first part of the question.
Basically, part of it is actually because young people don't vote. So at the moment, if I remember correctly, and I should remember this because it's actually my PhD, but I've forgotten the exact stat. I think young people are about 25 percentage points less likely to vote than pensioners. So it's not just about the system is kind of stacked against us, also about the fact that we don't vote. And one thing to happen, you don't vote, is that you don't turn out, or your votes, your opinions don't count at that point in time. And I think a misnomer is that people kind of go, there's loads of pensioners, that's why they have loads of political power. That's not actually true at all. Like, pensioning aging doesn't make an impact, because if you have a larger group of people, you can give them all £1 each, but it costs you more money to give that larger group more money, if that makes sense, right? So £1 per person to pensioners, a larger group, is more expensive than giving £2 to young people, for example. And so you have to think about, like, why is the case? And actually the reason why pensioners have electoral power, a large part of it because they do vote, and they're also incredibly well distributed. I think in another way is actually like the demands aren't super clear sometimes, and sometimes I don't think super helpful. So, for example, I agree with you, like, it's absurd that graduates pay over 40% in tax, but also, like, what's a simplistic demand always been? End tuition fees. Okay, let's end tuition fees, right? But then you've got the maintenance loan, which is still sitting there. And given the size of it and given the interest rate, it means that most people still aren't going to pay off the principal, and you've still got this tax. You need to actually understand, like, or rather have a clear policy ask and a policy demand. I think that's probably the second bit. And I think also make clear what the results are. Like, see, the second part of the question is about young families. Yeah, the birth rate's fallen by 15% in the last 5 years. I think 100,000 fewer babies born last year. That's a huge problem, right? A society that's not looking after its young. So I think, look, vote, have clear demands, and be clear on what the outcome is for this country in its future.
Thanks. James is asking, James, do you want to unmute yourself, or I can read out the question? Are we doomed by demographics? So he's asking, has the aging population of the UK changed the electoral population in a way that government has to now prioritise the elderly more? Jeevun, is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, I think basically on the electoral side, it's not that aging itself necessarily. It is the distribution that's making the difference. But it's not like, never fall into fatalism. Okay, never turn around and say, we're all doomed, it's terrible. Like, you know, there was a period in the United States when Black people couldn't have the vote. There was no literal way for them to pull kind of the lever to change things, but things did change and people can change things. So, you know, it's not that that's going to drive you away, but it's kind of saying, okay, here's the constraints. How do you get what we want?
Amazing. And Alana and John, like, as young people, how do you feel your peers are when it comes to voting? Like, do you think the government should be doing more to back up Jeevun's point of young people just aren't voting?
Well, from my personal point of view, within my circle, I don't know. It's probably not particularly representative of the of the national population. I don't know, university educated, highly politicized. Amongst my friends, it's very common to vote, but I think in general, I don't know, there is this feeling of apathy, and a large part of it does come down to the voting system. You know, because I think a lot of people my age don't feel particularly represented by either of the two major parties, Conservatives or Labour. And if we had a less punitive voting system for smaller parties, people would be much more willing to, you know, actually go out and vote for a party that, you know, actually represents their views. A lot of my friends would love to go out and vote Labour. Would love to go out and vote Green, but, you know, because it's essentially a wasted vote. You know, people don't end up going and voting. And also, sort of another problem with the first past the post system is that, as Jeevun kind of mentioned before, young people are incredibly sort of the distribution of young people within the country is very electorally inefficient. So you end up having these massive, sort of Labour majorities in major cities, whereas sort of in more rural areas where young people have often moved out of, sort of there are much more marginal seats. So I don't know. For me, it comes down to reforming the electoral system towards a more sort of proportional representation system would not only get more young people to vote, because they would be sort of feel more inclined to vote for parties that they actually feel represent their interests, but it would also sort of even out some of the spatial inefficiencies of the current system.
Alana, is there anything you want to add to that?
I agree. So most of my friends don't vote, so I'm exactly the opposite of John in terms of I vote. Not even my boyfriend votes. Like, so many people I know, I think a lot of my friends that they didn't go to university and things like that, or they're not interested in politics or anything really. And I do think, I had somebody literally said to me, it doesn't affect me. Like, literally, politics doesn't affect me. Yes, it does. It affects absolutely everything about, like, your what you're being paid, how much it costs you, such and such, your taxes, etc., etc. And they just didn't see it. And I think it's maybe a lack of education. I think also understanding where we're at. I think a lot of people only think of the short term, maybe only think of how it will benefit them now. Maybe if there was a bit more education as well on kind of the long-term impacts of certain policies, which have obviously led to a decline for a lot of younger people now, but they benefited somebody at some point, or they're still benefiting other people. I do think proportional representation, it's that same thing. Like, I do sometimes think, what does my vote count really? Because I was in basically a predominantly kind of one party area, and the kind of people who lived in that area were all going to vote that. So it's kind of like, it's almost pointless. But if it was proportional representation, you would feel maybe a bit more like every vote counts a little bit more. But yeah.
Moving on to our next question, Alec, would you like to unmute? Or am I going to read this one out as well?
I don't mind.
You've managed to do it. Go for it.
Yeah, so Jeevun, you mentioned that we basically just need to put more money in the pockets of young people. And of course, that sounds right. But do you think the way to do that is more these kinds of long-term things that we have been talking about, such as, building more housing, doing something more along those lines to simply lower living costs? Or do you think it's more efficient to do something that directly puts more money into people's pockets, such as raising the minimum wage, for example?
Yeah, I think the things I mentioned before, obviously, like taken to the bank, the minimum wage is not very good for reducing poverty. So basically, around 70% of those working age, 70% of kids in poverty are in working households. About 2/3 of adults, non-pensioner adults, are the same. And so the problem at the moment is actually, the UK is the lowest unemployment rate now, for 50 years probably. But the problem is that, like, you earn the minimum wage, you're still not getting enough. And so actually, why is that? Well, wages are just too low. That's why the new Labour government introduced tax credits. And also universal credit means that for every extra pound you earn, you're having that withdrawn, or 55p of that is being withdrawn. And if you're kind of also got national insurance on top of that and income tax, if you're earning more than £12,500, all of a sudden you've got this kind of, the margins aren't falling down. I mean, that actually the increase in minimum wage, you're really not seeing that much more money in your pocket. Don't get me wrong, it's still good. It still helps. If it doesn't increase unemployment, absolutely go for it. I will say the idea of a national minimum wage at £15 is like bonkers. Like, if you want a surgical strike to level down the country, that's a £15 minimum wage. The average wage in Blackpool is about £10 an hour. If you did that, you're just going to throw out every single low-wage person. Don't do that. Definitely increase universal credit as the way to do it, direct cash payments. And also, if you want to raise wages otherwise, in the longer term, yeah, productivity matters, but also unions matter a lot. A way for people to effectively bargain at work to get higher wages is really important. as is that what we actually have at the moment, which is a low unemployment labour market. So certainly better ways to bargain for higher wages are good, definitely worth doing. Increasing minimum wage is, again, a good idea if the market can kind of bear it, but you do want to find a way to like directly start directing cash into people's pockets. Really think about where exactly that money is going and how it's going to, who it's going to help and how much it's going to help them.
I hope that answers your question. John, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just quickly, I don't know, sort of there's more ways, because essentially, I don't know, sort of what we're trying to do is improve people's spending power, right? So like, one way to do it is to give people more cash. Another way is to provide, you know, sort of better services for free, you know, I don't know, by sort of expanding the welfare state again, sort of, you know, having the state build housing again, sort of like it did back in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and being able to, you know, for local councils to be able to offer affordable social housing, sort of doesn't directly put money in people's pockets, but it means that they'll spend much, much less of their income on housing, which sort of will drastically increase their sort of their spending power. And sort of all other forms of sort of taking services that people currently pay for and providing them for free is, I guess, another way of improving people's spending power. So offering, I don't know, sort of affordable childcare and those other kind of services are another really efficient way of improving people's spending power without just, you know, sort of like handing people money, which again, I don't want to sound like too much of a monetarist, but I don't know, sort of could lead to sort of something of an inflation pressure. So better services rather than just giving people money is as well important.
No, definitely it is important. The two go hand in hand. Angus, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, I think that's worked. Hi, Alisa. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my question to the panel really is about old people's attitudes, older people, sorry, excuse my language, older people's attitudes towards the young. Do you think that, do you think they know what's happening and they just don't care? Or do you think they aren't aware of the squeeze that the young people are under financially? And if the latter, that they care but they're not aware, is it because they're not on Twitter, or is it because young people are too ashamed to tell them of the financial squeeze they're suffering and blame it on themselves to some extent? Or is it just that young people are too polite to mention it? A bit like one of those sort of social situations where you absolutely want to do something, but the social pressure is not to.
So anyone can answer that. That's to the panel. Does anyone want to go first?
I mean, I can give it a go. I mean, I think that a lot of them don't know the financial sector, because I think everyone to an extent is going under some kind of financial pressure. There will be a lot of pensioners who are also under financial pressure. So for them, I think it's, even if it's maybe less, I mean, depending on obviously the pensioner, not all pensioners are wealthy. So it depends on the level of stress they're under, but they might not realize that they might be in a better position than a lot of young people. And I do think that when you are under kind of financial stress, or, you know, something's not quite right, I think everyone does have a little bit of a every man for themselves attitude, but not necessarily in a selfish way, but they might just not realize the extent of other people's problems. I don't think that people are out to get people. I just think that maybe a bit more education. I don't think it's necessarily, oh yeah, they're not on Twitter. I think it's a combination. I know some like older people who are just like get a bit defensive about the idea that they are a bit privileged. And then there's the other end of it where there are also young people who don't say anything because it is a bit awkward maybe. And it's not necessarily a blame game, but I think it's just acknowledging the inequalities, but it can be hard without somebody maybe feeling attacked or, you know, something like that. So that's just my opinion on it.
John, I can see you nodding. Is there anything that you want to add to that?
I mean, I definitely do agree. I think for me, sort of, it's mostly a question of sort of not realizing, like both sides almost, not realizing, you know, sort of young people, especially sort of amongst my age group, people kind of assume that the current situation is normal. You know, sort of like housing has always been expensive. You know, paying for your education is, you know, sort of like that's just natural. That's the way of the world. But, you know, sort of looking back in history, you know, sort of university was free until 1999. You know, sort of back in the 80s, it was possible to get you know, relatively affordable housing. You know, sort of on a single sort of a family with one earner. So I think us young people sort of don't realize how it could be, how good it could be, and older people sort of maybe casting back from their own experience of their youth, you know, sort of don't realize how tough it is right now. Essentially, that would be my main point. And then sort of another side point, I suppose, would be sort of survey after survey shows that older people do actually care about young people. You know, sort of when asked, you know, sort of about their opinions on the environment, sort of they say that they want to provide, you know, sort of a livable earth for young people, and, you know, sort of want their children and their grandchildren to have a better life. But when it comes down to their sort of, you know, sort of more behavioural attitudes, would they be willing to make a change? I think sort of data often shows that doesn't quite line up with the intentions, with sort of with their aims. So I don't know sort of where that discrepancy comes from, but I don't think it's a question, of people sort of older generations not caring. It's kind of maybe not realizing sort of how dire the situation is, and also, I don't know, sort of a difficulty implementing that change in practice.
Great. Moving on to David. I don't think this is a question, but David, do you want to say your point? Go for it.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much. I suppose I could paraphrase it into a question, and that would be, to what extent do you think that young people have been failed by our education system, which has just been encouraging people to go and do, you know, any graduate degree for sort of the past 15 years, and therefore now we have this massive disparity between people who have degrees, and that some people have got really in-demand skills that means that they can earn 100 grand a year, and other people don't, because lots of other people have the same degree. And the same thing also sometimes applies between the non-graduates too, because some of those people have also got great skill sets that the market's rewarding them for. And that's not targeted at anyone. I'm just interested to hear what people have to say.
I think that's really interesting, because I feel like there's a real push for people to go to university. I know when I was in school, that was always where you're going. That was it. There was no alternative routes. I know currently apprenticeships are picking up a bit. You know, they're more available. When I finished like college, there was very little apprenticeships. There was like, am I going to go into retail, or am I going to go to uni? I went to uni. I did a bit of a silly degree, if I'm being honest. My degree was in prosthetic makeup. So it's like, it's not useful in any way, shape or form. But I had always been told and always been taught a degree is worth something. It's good to have a degree no matter what it's in. And I found out at the end of that wasn't true. And I had to go back and do an apprenticeship to get a job. And that's me and my silly degree. But there's people who have good degrees and they struggled to get a good job, or even a reasonable salary. They're like working for minimum wage after they've graduated. They have good degrees. But there's so many people with that same degree now. Like back in the day, having a degree, you stood out. You were, we want you because you've got a degree. Here's an amazing salary. These days, to have the lowest rung job, you need to have a degree.
Yeah, I would add to that. It's a great point. I think there hasn't been enough thinking in terms of UK kind of education policy about that particular divide. It was kind of like, go to university or get this other qualification, but no real idea about the kind of skills that we need and the kind of jobs we're getting. We never really have had a great industrial policy, and actually more thinking about that would have been great and actually should be done as well. There should definitely be routes to good jobs for everybody. And there should also be an idea that irrespective of the qualification you get, there will be jobs at the end of it. And more broadly as well, if we're accepting that the labour market's going to keep changing because technology will keep changing things, actually like proper lifelong learning as well. And I think that has been a real failure. I think there's been a lot of cuts to further education, which have also caused huge problems. The real failure of education policy isn't actually at the point of at the point people come to 18 years old. It's actually the point when they're like 1 and 2 years old. You know, we know that low income children, by the time they get to school, are already kind of a few months behind their other peers. They've already heard so many million fewer words. They're 20 percentage points less likely to be able to kind of read and speak in the same standard as their average peers. When you're young is when the real kind of changes to your skills start to happen. And actually there's not enough there, not just not enough good childcare provision, which there isn't, but also if you are a child today going hungry, you're not going to learn well, you're not going to earn very much when you're older. And if you're a parent struggling to pay the bills, like it's pretty hard to sit down with the kids and do the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s, and all the things we know that will make a difference later on. As there certainly are like failures of education policy. I think the real failure has been at the moment, certainly, is how we're treating our youngest children, given how much skills develop and given how poor provision is there at the moment.
Thank you both. Does that answer your question, David? Great. We've only got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to have one more question. Coming back to James, can you unmute this time?
Yeah, I figured it out. I'll keep it shorter than what I wrote, but broadly, I guess, in a decade or two, do you see these problems affecting the next generation? Is this like a one-off shock that's been brought up by economic factors coming to bear, like political issues of like reaching young generation, or is this a trend that's getting worse? Like, depending on like the factors that you see most important, is this the end? Is this the worst part and it will get better? Or do you foresee this getting worse for the like coming young people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because that's Generation Alpha. That's the next gen after Gen Z. So what do you think, John?
For me, I don't know. I think there's maybe not a misperception, but sort of an underappreciation of how important sort of redistributing resources between generations is in terms of the welfare state. You know, we often see the welfare state as, you know, sort of a Robin Hood type deal, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. But actually in reality, sort of it's smoothing consumption over the life cycle. So making sure that people have pension provisions and that sort of thing is a more important role for the welfare state. I think sort of over 50% of welfare spending is sort of age related rather than, you know, sort of, you know, from rich to poor. And as we've kind of hinted at before, sort of the UK is undergoing a demographic transition. So 2 huge baby booms in the mid-1940s and mid-1960s sort of are coming into retirement, which is dragging up the old, sort of those 2 factors in combination with sort of increasing life expectancy, which are obviously really good things, but policy making didn't foresee these sort of, you know, like the problems that this would cause essentially. So this increasing dependency ratio and sort of potentially overly generous pensions means that the demographic transition is going to cause some real problems, and something at some point has got to give. You know, sort of either taxes are going to need to go up on young people, or we're going to need to sort of quite seriously rethink pensions in the UK. So I personally do see things getting a little worse for a while, but as Jeevun said, I don't know, we shouldn't slip into fatalism. Like, it is possible for things to get better, but we need to properly start having these kind of conversations and having some serious like long-term planning in government from now on.
And Jeevun, any final words?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I sat there for a moment, was like, yeah, what is going to happen? That was a brilliant question. I actually haven't thought about it in any detail ever before. I think, okay, one thing, there are things that kind of, because it's not just the case that like structural forces will happen and that's it. Like, I think as been pointed out there, like if you, people can respond in certain ways. So the idea that, for example, our labour market, we know high paid jobs are performed by people with like, generally speaking, high levels of education, work together in major cities, I don't think is going to end anytime soon. There's nothing structurally that would suggest that's going to change. I mean, we've seen that through a pandemic, right? We've had this pandemic where everyone remote worked, and actually at the end of it all, we could start working again in person. Everyone still wants to come to the office to some degree. I don't see that changing. So therefore, the pressure on housing, on all the other problems we're talking about is still there. But, and there's the really big but, if you have policy change in a much more healthy way, which goes actually like, let's develop cities outside of London, for example. Crossrail is great, but how about we like electrify rail lines in the north, for example, as is, you know, how much the bus travel, you know, how cheap it is in London compared to elsewhere in the country. So you can absolutely change these structural forces to mean that you can kind of redistribute young people to major cities around and ensure they have decent lives. But those structural pressures are not going to go away. You know, that demographic transition, that's not going to change. So I see that as like a force that continues, but policy can react in a way that means that it doesn't have to mean that, like, you know, the next generation who comes up in 10 years' time does not need to have as bad a kind of go as we have had. And finally, like, as a millennial, and I'm aware that like now there are young people who are younger than me, like, put it that way, like we've been through like two shocks, like the Great Recession, the largest fall in income since the Great Depression, and now of course the once in a century pandemic. I'm really hoping nothing like that happens again.
Thank you. I know we are at time, so if people need to head off, feel free to go, but I do want to come to Alana if you had any final words.
Oh, okay. What was the question again? Sorry.
It was looking at whether things are going to get better for the next generation.
Oh,
what do you think?
yeah, I remember. I was listening. I did think it was great, but I was listening to the answers and forgot what the question was. So basically, I think the point of this group, or the point of this foundation, is in the hopes that things will get better and we'll hopefully get there. But at the same time, I do think, obviously, with there obviously being like the larger cohort of older people, and with, you know, a larger kind of pension burden maybe falling on a lesser amount of young people, we're already seeing people are not having as many children, and that does then, but if we're in a worse financial situation due to being financially strained our whole lives and then moving up into our kind of older years, it does concern me what's going to be left for the generation after us. Yeah, I definitely, I agree, I do think it's going to get worse to some extent, but hopefully we're going to be able to kind of, by policy change, kind of pad that out and make it not as bad, and hopefully kind of recognize what's happened and maybe improve in the future. But I definitely see it getting maybe a bit worse before it gets better.
Hopefully it does get better eventually. Okay, so we have reached time. We've gone a little bit over. I would like to thank everybody for attending. A special thanks to our panelists and audience members who asked questions. I hope this evening has been really, really eye-opening to a very real and scary reality that young generations and future generations are facing. And I think the more that we talk about it, the better. So this has been really, really enlightening. So thank you and have a lovely evening.